Okay, we are going to, first, make sure you click the subscribe button and give me a thumbs up if you like the video. This will be a video for the small size Parachute Knapsack. This pattern is available in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. Small is like a super mini, trendy kind of backpack. Medium is smaller than a full size, like you wouldn't be able probably to carry a full-size notebook or folder in it. But it's good for people who like to carry more than like the super mini, but I would still classify it maybe as more like a purse type of bag than backpack. The large is like an actual backpack big enough for school to take everything in. Right now we're going to make the small out of vinyl only. The pattern calls for woven fabric and to be interfaced, and there is another video for that. If you want to make it according to pattern instructions, go ahead and follow that video. This will just show you a variation on how to make it with waterproof canvas lining and vinyl exterior, so neither of these will be interfaced. So let's get started. First, I did adhere a piece of Decovil Light to the back side of where the snaps will be installed. I'm going to measure up 3 inches and centered from the bottom to install the snap on the pocket, exterior pocket panel. Let's see. Oh, actually, instead of measuring, you can use the pattern piece because there are snap placement marks on the pattern pieces. Let's do that. Okay, and then I always kind of flip it over and just make sure that like it is centered. I don't know. Okay, so here we're going to install 1/2 of the snap. It doesn't really matter which half. I generally install the female half, which is what it's called, but the one that has like the innie side. So use the washer, line the mark up in the center of the washer, and then mark the prong placement, and then use your seam ripper. This is my seam ripper and stiletto that I got from Mary Beth Made It. It's custom with my logo. So now I'm just going to cut along the prong marks only, carefully. We're going to close the seam ripper up because hopefully I won't need that again. But the other end of this is a stiletto, which is super helpful for sewing when you don't want to get your fingers in the way. Alright, and then I'll just install that half of the snap here. Some people push their snaps open, some people push them closed. I don't know if one way is better than another. I know that if you press them open, it like kind of lays flatter. If you press them closed, I think it actually is supposed to maybe be stronger that way. I don't know. Rainbow magnetic snaps and the zipper pulls I'll be using today are from Bedazzled Supplies. And then the other hardware I'll be using today is from mormino.com. This vinyl is from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends. Everything will be tagged in the description or linked in the description. I'm going to use seatbelt webbing from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends, and also, what else? Zipper tape from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends. So, okay. We now want to take the front pocket pattern piece, and I've cut the dart placement line out, and I'm just going to mark it on the wrong side of the exterior front pocket and the lining front pocket. And if you're in my Facebook group, I put up a poll on thread color to use. Well, not like a actual poll, but I asked purple or lime green or like a neon green. And I feel like it was very 50-50, and I decided on purple with a green zipper. So we'll see how that turns out. Hopefully good. Some people said black, and I like to use this thread from Saya Swag Bags, and I don't actually have black because it was out of stock when I ordered, and I haven't ordered again. So, okay. So these are marked. I'm going to fold this right sides together, lining up both sides of the dart on the front and the back. So you're folding it directly up the middle of the dart. And then just so, starting at the bottom, and I'm going to use a shorter stitch length, so I have it on 3, and I'm just gonna sew from the bottom up to the tip of the dart, and then back stitch. I'm actually going to back stitch all the way, and then I'll repeat that process on the other 3 darts. Okay. I would also like to add that I use a size 20 needle with the Tex 70 thread from Saya Swag Bags. She also has Tex 45 now, which is for domestic machines. So if you are looking for that, check her thread out. It's awesome. Now I'm going to trim away the extra seam allowance from the back of the dart. And I'm just trimming it to about 1/8 of an inch on both the lining and exterior. And now if I was using quilting cotton, I would press the darts opposite ways. So I would press the darts on the lining facing away from the center of the bottom, and then press the darts on the exterior facing toward the center on the bottom, and that way they would nest together. I can't press this really since it's vinyl and waterproof canvas, so I'm just going to skip that. I'm going to place these right sides together. And you can still kind of nest the seams. I don't know if you can see. I have the vinyl going that way, the waterproof canvas going this way, and then the seams just nest together. So I'm going to clip first at the darts so that they line up nicely. All right, bottom centers. And then just kind of clip all the way around, match the top corners. So we are going to leave a turning hole at the top of this. And I think I say to leave about 3 inches. So I'm just going to measure out 3 inches in the center, and I'm going to mark this, because if I don't mark it, I will forget, and I will just sew the whole thing closed. Okay. So now I'm just going to start at 1 mark, and we're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And I turn my stitch length back, let's use 4 actually for the assembly, and then 5 for top stitching. This thicker thread, I like to use a longer stitch length. Always stop in the corners with your needle in the down position. And then I'll just kind of raise the whole thing up to go around those darts. And then back to the other mark, and make sure you back stitch at the start and stop. Okay, now I'm going to trim down the sides and at the corners. I'm not going to trim the top edge, so that way when I turn the seam in, it doesn't look oddly bulky in the center, because you don't want to trim where your opening is so that you have something to fold inside. If I was using cotton, I would probably trim the top, just not along the opening, and then I would press it in. So, okay, I'm going to turn this right side out. All right, and then I have a stick that I use to push out the corners whenever I turn something right side out. So first I'll push out the corner, and then I just kind of push out all the seams. And I actually think I might give this a press from the waterproof canvas side. I have pressed waterproof canvas from the fabric side, not from the plasticky side, and it's fine. So you just want to be careful not to touch the vinyl, the right side of the vinyl to the iron at any point in time. Okay, I'm going to give this a quick press. Okay, so we're going to top stitch along the opening only, or along the whole top edge, which will close the opening. And I'm using, I think with the vinyl I might use 1/4 of an inch. No, I'm going to use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I might put 2 lines of stitching here. So I'm going to do a couple stitches and then back stitch, and keep in mind that this will be visible on the bag, so it's not like back stitching that's hidden somewhere. And right now we are only top stitching along the top straight edge. Okay. Now I think 1 line is good enough. So now we're going to make the flap. So again, I have already installed a piece of Decovil Light, or fuse, not installed. And I'm going to use the pattern piece for the pocket flap to mark my rivet placement, or my magnetic snap placement. Check to make sure that's centered. Looks good. And this is the male half of the snap. So again, I'll just use my washer I'm cutting only along those 2 prong placement marks. Okay, now we want to place the flap lining and the flap exterior right sides together, matching all edges. And we are not sewing along the long straight edge. Okay, so we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm back to a stitch length of 4. So if I don't say what my stitch length is all along, for assembly parts, it's 4, top stitching, it is 5. All right, and I back stitch at the start and stop. Generally, I back stitch at the start and stop of every seam unless it's top stitching, unless I specify that you should. So now I'm going to trim the seam allowance here down to about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit longer than that. And then trim the corners off as well. You can use, or you can cut notches here. I find if you cut the seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch, you don't need to do notches, which saves a lot of time. Alright, so now we want to turn this flap right side out. Make sure that the corners are poked out nicely. And again, I'm going to press this from the waterproof canvas side. Okay, so now we're going to top stitch down one side, across the bottom curved edge, and then up the other side. Stitch length is 5. And I'm using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'll be careful here where the snap is, just to make sure that I don't get it caught in anything on the machine and end up with weird stitches. I've done that before. Maybe one more stitch to get to the 1/8 mark. Okay, and then you can actually also baste the open edge closed at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance too. You don't have to do this step, but okay, now on the front main, which I made sure the front main and the back main are different sizes. So when I cut them out, I labeled on the back, front main, back main. Also, some of the pockets are very similar in size, so I labeled those as well. So I am going to measure right now 6 inches. I want my bigger roller. 6.5 inches up from the bottom straight edge and centered. So this is about 8.5 wide. So centered would be 4 1/4 inches in from the side. I wonder if the, okay, it's actually less. It's 8 3/8 of an inch. So yeah. Oh, you could use your pattern piece to find the center. How far? 6.5 inches. All right, my ruler is 6 inches wide. So I'll use another ruler to measure the other 1/2 inch. And then my ruler is centered here, and I want the line I marked to be 6.5 inches wide. So 3 1/4 out from the center on each side. Okay, and now I'm going to place the pocket, or the flap, I'm sorry, centered with the raw edge against the line I marked. And then I will make sure that it's straight and centered before I sew it on. I'm just going to put a couple of these clips on. So the tricky part with vinyl is that you can't pin. So you have to use tape where you can. This is not really a situation where you can use tape either. So these clips are a little longer, and that's helpful. So it's a little less than 1 inch. It's 7/8 of an inch from the side there. Seven-eighths there. Okay. That looks good. And now we're going to sew this on using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so I'm actually going to change my foot because this one is 1/8 of an inch. So I'll just put on my Teflon foot, which the edge of the foot is 1/4 of an inch. So So I want to be very careful to keep my stitches on the pocket flap and don't go past it, because that will be visible on the front of the bag. And I'm just sewing all the way along the top raw edge. Okay, and now we'll fold the pocket flap up. Another thing that would be easier with cotton, because you could press it. So you want to make sure that the main body of the bag stays nice and flat. You don't want to let it fold up also. So I would press this flat if I was using different materials. And then we're actually going to top stitch that using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to mark that out with an erasable pen. Alright, and then I'll start sewing right on top of the pocket flap, a few stitches and back stitch, and just don't go over the pocket flap edge, and then sew directly along the line that I marked. And then I would press this down if you're using pressable material. And then we want to line the pocket up right at the bottom of the flap. Make sure that your snap lines up. Okay, and that will be fine once if I hit this with some heat to get this to fold down. So make sure that your pocket snaps okay and that everything fits together before you sew the pocket on. So I have my pocket lined up directly at the bottom of the flap where the flap is attached. And I'm just going to place some clips on the best I can. It's not really a clippable area. You could probably use a few pieces of double-sided tape at the very edge of the seams, and that would also hold it down. So I'm just going to use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let me switch back to my other foot. Starting at the top, I'm just going to do a couple stitches and then back stitch a couple stitches. You could also place a rivet at the top, and then I'm just going to stitch all the way around the pocket using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. You have to kind of squish the edges down where the darts are to sew around them. Okay. Now I'll just unsquish my pocket. Okay. And I can just hit that with a hot blow dryer to get that to lay nice and flat. But the thickness of the vinyl is what's causing it to pull like that, but the finished bag won't pull. Also, if you were using a thinner vinyl, this vinyl is pretty heavy enough. You might still want to use Decovil Light on it, like you would on fabric. Alright, so now we're going to install the pocket into the back main. Okay, so I have marked all of my rectangle pieces with what they are on the wrong side. So these are the exterior zip pockets. What we're going to do right now is on the wrong side of one exterior zip pocket, we're going to make a mark that is 1 inch in from the left side and 1 inch up from the bottom and stops 1 inch from the top. And this is just a 5-inch long line. We're then going to go 1/2 inch from that mark and do another. And then we'll draw 2 lines to make that a box. So now this is something that I'm going to do a little bit differently because I'm using vinyl. So in order to cut the box out, or I mean, if I did it like a regular, I would sew this right sides together. I would cut in the center, and then I would have to press it. With vinyl, that doesn't really work. So I'm going to measure 1 inch in, and this will be from the right side, the right edge on the wrong side. And then I want to draw 1 inch up from the bottom, a 5-inch line. So I'm pretty much making a mark in the same exact spot. And then 1/2 inch from that, also 1 inch up from the bottom. Okay, and now I need to carefully cut out this box and cut out this box. So you can use a rotary cutter, you can use scissors. I'm going to use my scissors, and I'm just very carefully cutting over to the line, and then I'm going to cut directly along the marked lines. Since I'm using waterproof canvas, it won't fray, and this is okay to do this. If I was using cotton fabric, I would probably sew a box to this with woven interfacing on the right side, put them right sides together, and then turn it and press the woven interfacing to the other side. I don't know if that makes sense. So that I would have the box open to sew to the other side of the vinyl without having raw edges on the lining portion. I don't know if that makes any sense without me showing you. So now I'll just carefully cut out this as well. Take your time and make sure it's nice and neat. And this way you'll actually not have the zipper tape on the inside of the pocket either, because we're going to put the zipper tape directly on the back of the vinyl, and then put the first lining panel that has the hole in it over the back of that. Okay, so let me see if that looks horrible. Looks okay. Clean up your edges from the right side if you need to. If you have edge coat or anything like that that you want to use, that's a place where you would use it, on raw edges of the vinyl. Okay, so now my zippers. This zipper tape I got from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends. I have a 5-inch opening, so I'm going to go ahead and cut just 7 inches of zipper tape, roughly. Which I probably should not be using like my good scissors for that, right? Okay, so my zipper pulls are from Bedazzled Supplies. Okay, and then you just have to make sure that you get this get the zipper pull on so that it's like lined up properly and you don't have like a bump on one side of the zipper, if that makes sense. If the teeth are misaligned, then you have like a bump on one side of your zipper. Okay. So those are actually like really pretty zipper pulls. And then the teeth from, or the zipper tape is from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends, and that also has like the rainbow, midnight rainbow teeth, whatever they call it. Okay, so then I'm just going to line this up within the opening. I'm going to put some double-sided tape on the very edge of the zipper tape. You could also put it on the edge of the vinyl. I try as much as possible not to sew through it if I don't have to. So So I'm just going to remove one side first of the tape. Try to keep my zipper pull out of that. Center the teeth within the opening. And I just find that it's easier to work with it when you only do one half at a time. Okay. Okay, and then I'm pressing the other side down, and you can just lift up and reposition as needed to make sure that your zipper is centered. Okay. And now, on the wrong side of that, I'm going to take 2 more strips of double-sided tape. Right to the edge of the zipper tape again. Okay, and then this we want to be right side up, so the wrong sides are together. Should have followed my own advice and only used one side of the tape at a time. And I'm just lining this up. Dang it. I want to line up the bottom and the right sides, the right edge, wrong sides together. And again, this is only because I'm using vinyl and waterproof canvas that I'm doing it this way. Okay. So you should have that right now. Now I'm just going to top stitch around this box. I usually start toward the bottom, or I usually start like on a long side, not at one of the ends. I don't know if it matters. Personal preference, I guess. And I'm using a stitch length of 5 for this because it's top stitching. And I pivot with my needle down always. So across the short edge and then down the other side again with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Too much stuff up here. And hopefully then when you get done, you flip it over and the hole was lined up properly. And that looks pretty good. And then you can cut your excess zipper tape if you want. It's actually not going to hurt anything to leave it there. Other than it could maybe get in the way later. Alright, and then we have our other exterior zipper panel, which I'm going to first pin together only the 2 zipper panels, right sides together along the top edge. Okay, and I'm going to sew along that top edge only using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm just folding the front main panel out of the way. Or I'm sorry, this is the back main. Okay. Now I want to trim this seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm actually cutting my zipper tape anyway, which is fine. And I'm going to cut this from this side just so I don't accidentally cut my main panel somehow. Alright, and now I want to go ahead and clip around the sides and bottom, and your pocket should reach the other edge pretty much. And then we're just going to baste all of this together. And I'm actually very glad I went with the purple thread. I really like it on this vinyl. And this vinyl also has a like white reflective or silver, and then like a glow in the dark option. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so now on the back side, we want to measure down from the top center 1.5 inches. So the center is marked from where I cut it out. To cut this out, I traced it. So I want 1.5 inches from the center. So I actually am going to put this on here, this ruler, to make sure that I have it straight. And then measure 1.5 inches from the center. Okay, and now I'm going to find the center of the Decoville Heavy strap connector piece, and I want to place that centered also directly beneath the mark that I just made. So the edge of it does slide under the pocket. So I'm just going to fuse that in place. Okay, so that is fused to the wrong side. I'm going to make the connector for the back. So I want to on the lining piece of the lining connector piece, I'm just going to draw a line that's a few inches long down the center, and we're actually going to cut it directly along that line. Okay, so now we're going to place the exterior and lining, which actually for the cotton bag, I have you cut 2 out of the exterior, so that way you don't have like a little bit of lining poking out on the sides. But I obviously wasn't going to use 2 layers of vinyl here. So really with using vinyl, you could leave it raw edge. So we'll see how this works out, and I could always cut another one. So now I'm just sewing all the way around the edges using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Alright, now we're going to trim the seam allowance down all the way around this. And I'm going to cut the corners at an angle. now I want to turn it right side out. Okay, and I actually just had a thought. Instead of doing that, the back piece should be woven interfacing. So I think I'm going to change that in the pattern. So instead of lining on the one side, it'll be woven interfacing. You sew the right side of the woven interfacing to the wrong side. Right? No, right. Yes, right sides together. Okay, so put it right sides together, turn it, and then the glue side will be facing the back of the exterior side of the connector, and then you can just press it down and it stays in place. So I'll be changing that in the pattern. All right, so now on the strap connector pieces, we're going to place a D-ring on and then fold 1 inch to the back. So, and I'm going to make a mark that's 2 inches down from one short edge. And that way I can fold it to that mark. Place, well, let's get a couple scraps of, or a couple small pieces of tape. I'm just placing this right above the line I marked. Put a D-ring onto the strap and then fold that down to the line you marked. And I'll repeat that on the other one. Okay, and then we're just going to sew a box, which there's a diagram in the pattern of how to sew it. So I'll start beneath my hardware and sew all the way across as close to the hardware as I can get. Turn and sew down to about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the webbing on the back. Sew across, back up to the line where you started. Alright, now I'm sewing back along that line again. No, I should have started my X right there. Don't listen to me. So, and I'm just going to do my X now then. So from the top corner down to one bottom corner, back along the bottom line a second time, and then from that corner up to the other top corner. And you can draw this box onto the connector if you want to. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this since it's all dark colors. But you can see that there's a rectangle with an X sewn in the middle. And I'll repeat that on the other connector. Make sure that you stop before you reach where the webbing is on the back, the end of it. Okay, right here is where I should go Number 5 is down to the bottom edge. Number 6, all the way back across. Back up to the other top corner. And then back across the first line again. Okay. So you really stop sewing the same place where you started sewing. Okay, so now we're going to repeat that with the straps and the sliders. So here we're going to fold 1/2 of an inch of the strap toward the back. There is no right side or wrong side of this webbing, by the way. So I'm going to mark 3 inches down since we're folding back 1.5 inches. And I'll mark that on both straps. And again, I'll use a couple pieces of double-sided tape. We just want to slide the strap over the slider bar thing on the hardware, whatever you call that. And I'm just lining that up with the line that I marked. And I'll do the same thing on this one. And if I didn't mention, I think I did, that this webbing is also from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends. Their seatbelt webbing. This is 1 inch wide. Hardware from moremeknow.com. Zipper pulls from Bedazzled Supplies. Vinyl from Bob and Jen's Odds and Ends. And zippers also. Alright. So, same process here. So, as close as I can to the hardware. Turn. So, down that edge. So, across the bottom, back up. From the top corner down to the bottom corner at an angle. Back across the bottom. From the bottom corner to the top corner. And then back along the first line. And then we'll repeat that on the other one. we are going to slide. We have the strap is facing up. Probably going to do this wrong. Yes, I want the strap facing the wrong way. So the edge that has the raw edge on it is facing up. Fold, take the end of the strap and pull it through the D-ring and bring it up this way. Oh, and I actually want my D-ring to be right side facing up also, so the raw edge should be at the back. Okay, so it's like that. Bring the raw end of your strap up and through the slider. Like that. Okay, so right here, just make sure that it works, that it's adjustable. It is. Do the same thing with the other one. So I want my strap wrong side up. Connector is right side up. Slide the raw end of the strap through the connector over the slider. All right. So now both of the straps are complete. Okay, so now on the right side of the exterior back main, I'm going to measure down 3 inches from the top raw edge and draw a line that is centered and 4 inches long. Also mark the center along the top side of the line. Okay. So 3 inches from the top, centered, 4 inches long. 3 inches down from the top, centered, and 4 inches long. Okay, and I want to mark that. So 2 inches out from the center on each side. Okay. And then I'm going to use tape for this. And I actually was supposed to mark the center, and I didn't. And I shouldn't guess, right? So this is my center. And you could also use the back main panel to mark your center. So I placed the tape above the mark that I made, and I want to take first the handle, and I'm placing it where the bottom raw edges are directly along that line, and the sides are right next to each other. So it should be like this. And I want to sew each part of this. I wonder if I could just, I'm going to try something. So we're going to sew the box stitches to this as well. But I'm going to, my foot is stuck to the tape. I'm going to sew the edges of both sides of the handle together at one time. So I want to sew up, I think, no more than an inch. And we are sewing over the Decoville Heavy that's behind the vinyl here, so there's a little something extra stabilizing the vinyl so that your vinyl isn't going to tear. Now on the top, we want to make sure the handle is right side down, so my connector or my hardware is facing down, and this is the raw edge that's away from the connector, and I'm going to place those directly next to the handle and also lined up with that mark that I made. Probably could have sewed all 4 of these parts on at one time. One more. And hopefully by the time we finish with this, the connector that will be sewn above the top of these straps will be flat from sitting in my heat press, which is turned off. And this would also be the perfect size for like a toddler who just wants a backpack. I would just make the straps shorter. So, and the other one, the medium size, is probably good for like a preschooler backpack if they don't need to fit a whole folder in it. I'm not sure if a folder would fit. That one does hold like most tablets, I think. Like an iPad you could definitely put in it. But I think it is too big or too small for like a folder, a full-size folder. Okay, so now I'm going to give it the connector. It's not horrible, so kind of flat. I'm going to stick one piece of double-sided tape on the inside to hold this cut edge closed, which I think will help it to not be quite as puffy. Put 2 pieces inside actually. This will be 2 inches down from the top raw edge. Okay, one more piece of tape. I'm probably going to have to stop for the day because I need to go to the grocery store. Oh, I should have measured my 2 inches first, huh? Two inches down would actually be 1 inch up from the bottom of these straps. So I'm just going to mark across the top of the straps 2 inches or 1 inch up from that bottom mark. And then I just want to make sure this is centered. So find the center. Okay. And now my longest stitch length, and I'm going to start, where do I want to start? I guess along the top straight edge. Right here. Just a couple stitches and then back stitch to secure. All right, and then I'm just going to sew all the way around this connector piece. And make sure while you're doing this that the other parts of your strap don't get under your presser foot and don't get sewn to the wrong side of the vinyl here. I'm going to slide my Decoville Heavy back under the zipper pocket. That is quite pretty. I really like how that's turning out. Okay, so now I need to make the marks for my strap placement. I'm going to use the back main pattern piece, and here's the strap connector placement marks. So I'm just going to cut along those two lines. And then I'll fold that back. Okay, and then just from the bottom corner, I'll line up my pattern piece on the back of the bag, the exterior side, on both sides. Okay, and then I just want to make sure this is not twisted, and place my strap connector. I want the bottom edge should be even with the side of the back panel, and it should lay within those lines, which is a 45-degree angle. And you can use tape or a clip to hold this in place. And I'm just going to use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to base those on. bottom edge, the bottom corner is lined up with the edge of the vinyl. And I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to base that in place. Alright, now just double check to make sure that your straps are not twisted. And I'm going to adjust both of the straps to be as short as possible, just to help keep everything out of the way. Well, I don't want my hardware right up at the top. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and install the interior zipper pocket. So that's the wrong piece. Remember I said I marked all of my rectangles, which is important because they're different sizes. So interior zip pocket, interior slip pocket. So on the wrong side, I'm going to measure 1 inch from the top and make a 6-inch line. And it should stop 1 inch from each end. Okay, and then 1/2 inch from that, we're going to make another line. Also 6 inches long. And then short lines at the end to complete the rectangle. So lining front main, remember I marked that. Normally I put zipper pockets on the back, but on this one I have like a full-size slip pocket, and I want that to be on the back in case somebody has like a tablet, which the small one maybe would only hold like a Kindle. But that's a good pocket for that. So we want this to be centered and 1/2 inch up from the bottom. Okay. Now I'm just going to put a couple clips on the sides to hold it in place. And I'm using a shorter stitch length for this, like 3.5 actually. So like shorter than my normal short one. I start on the bottom, stitch a couple stitches, and then back stitch. I was gonna say back space. Stop at the corner with the needle in the down position and rotate. Oh, I actually ran out of bobbin thread at like a convenient time, and that never happens. Huh. Switch that back to the long stitch length for when I top stitch. Alright, so right now we're going to cut down the center of the pocket. I'm just going to fold it to get that started. And you can draw these lines on if you want. I generally would. So directly down the center, and then from the end of that cut to each of the corners, and do not clip through your stitching. And get as close as you can though to the corner as possible, because that will reduce the like wrinkliness and pulling, I guess. Okay. So now I'm hoping that this will kind of just crease enough for me without ironing it. I'm just folding first where all of the seams are, and then I'm going to pull the pocket through the hole so that it is wrong sides together with the front lining main. And I'm just kind of finger pressing that. I wonder if I had something hard to kind of crease it with. Yeah, I am going to go ahead and just press this flat with that iron. Alright, I pressed that nice and flat from this side. Now we'll go ahead and put the zipper in. So I'm going to, let's see how I want to do this. I think I'm actually going to see if this works better. I usually put the double-sided tape on the zipper, but I want to see how I feel about putting it directly on the fabric. And I'm putting it a little distance away from the opening, so hopefully I'm not just sewing through it the whole time, because it can gum up my needle. It doesn't always, and it's not horrible when it does. Okay, and that should cover perfectly. So I'm just going to remove one side of the tape at a time. The paper off the tape, not the tape. And I'm just making sure that my zipper is centered. Okay. Let's go ahead and top stitch this. And I like to start at the bottom beneath the zipper pull. I'm using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, and I switched back to my stitch length of 5. So I just do a few stitches and then back stitch. Always stop with my needle down to rotate. Just trim the seams or the threads. We will place the two interior zipper pocket panels right sides together. And I'm just going to clip them together, making sure not to clip the front lining main to them. And I melted the waterproof canvas to itself when I pressed it. Okay, and I'm leaving the bottom open. So I'm going to start on the bottom here, back to my stitch length of 4, just a few stitches and back stitch. And we're going to turn the whole bag through this pocket when we're done, so don't forget the back stitch. Alright, and as you can see, I'm just folding the lining main panel out of the way as I go. Okay, and then we just want to go ahead and trim the seam allowances down. And you can trim off the ends of the zipper as well. So we'll move on to our slip pocket now. So we've got the lining back and 2 interior slip pockets. We'll place the 2 interior slip pocket panels right sides together, and I'm going to clip along the top edge only. And I'm just going to sew those together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim that seam allowance down, which really is not that important. Of all the seam allowances, you could leave it. And then I just flip this so the panels are wrong sides together, and I'll place a couple clips on it to hold everything in place. And then just kind of, the clips seem to work okay, so I'm going to crease the seam. Okay, and then we'll just go ahead and top stitch this using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and my stitch length on 5. And I don't know, I guess you could fit like a Kindle. Like I have my Kindle Paperwhite, that would definitely fit in this pocket. So I'm just going to baste down the sides and across the bottom. Okay, so I start here with the exterior front zipper panel, which is this one that has the concave curve. So yeah, that way. We lay the zipper right side together with the long straight edge. And I'm going to use a stitch length of 4 for this. So I'm going to sew this line. We'll start all the way at the end. I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I just sew a few stitches and back stitch. Move the zipper pulls out of your way. And this is a double pull zipper, by the way. Okay. I like to trim all my threads as I go. Okay, now I want to take the front lining zipper panel, and on the wrong side I'm going to mark 5/8 of an inch in from each end along the long straight edge. So alright, so now I'm going to place that right sides together with the exterior zipper panel that's already attached. Make sure again that they're both the same one, the front zipper panel. And I'm making sure the centers match because the centers are marked from when I cut it out. Okay, and now I want to start sewing at that first mark. Still using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but I'm sewing starting 5/8 of an inch in from the end. Make sure you back stitch. All right, and then stop when you reach the other 5/8 inch mark and back stitch. Okay, so now you would press both of these away from the zipper, but this is not very easy to press vinyl and waterproof canvas. So first I'm going to kind of crease the lining away from the zipper because that's easier. And then I'll fold the vinyl away as well, and I'll just place some clips on it to hold things in place. And then I just have to remember as I top stitch to continue pulling them, the panels away from the zipper. Okay, and now we'll top stitch this using a 5/8 inch, or I'm sorry, an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. But first, I need to measure in again 5/8 of an inch from the edge along the straight edge and make a mark, and use something that's erasable because this will show. And from the other end as well. So we're going to top stitch only from each mark. Okay, let's see. And I put my stitch length back on 5. And I'm using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm just going to continually pull the zipper panels away from the zipper as I sew, since I could not press it. But this is important so that we can turn the bag and not do binding or a drop in. So make sure you do that part. Okay. So trim the threads. I want to repeat this process on the other side of the zipper gusset. So place the zipper right side down, on top of the right side. I'm going to actually trim the ends of my zipper tape so that they're even with the end of the vinyl. And now I'm just going to clip the zipper in place all the way along the straight edge of the vinyl, right sides together. Now this line I can sew all the way from one end to the other. Back to my shorter stitch length of 4 and a 3/8 inch seam allowance the whole length of the zipper. Okay. Now let's make sure we mark our 5/8 inch marks. So first I'm matching my centers. I mean, I guess I don't need to do it that way or in that order. I just need to make sure that the entire zipper panel matches with the other. And these are right sides together and the zipper is sandwiched in between. Alright, so we'll just start sewing at the first mark. And still using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now the same thing. I'm going to press both of these lining, or both of the back zipper panels away from the zipper and wrong sides together. This really helps to crease the waterproof canvas when you fold it. Okay, and then I'll just clip those together again, just to hold everything in place. Let's measure our 5/8 marks here and hope that I start and stop in the right place. Switch back to my stitch length of 5, and again I need to continuously pull the panels away from the zipper. So I'm just going to do a few stitches starting at my 5/8 inch mark. And then just the whole way as you sew down the zipper, make sure that you're pulling both of the panels away from the zipper. And I think it's about to thunderstorm, so I might be done soon. That is one pretty zipper panel. And that curved zipper is much easier to sew than it looks, right? Because really it's a straight zipper. Just when it's sewn onto the bag, it ends up looking curved. Alright, let's go ahead and sew the side panels on. So, you might want to mark your top and bottom because the sides are a little bit longer than the top and bottom are. So I want to place the panel right sides together with the exterior ends. And I'm going to sew with the lining side up so that I can make sure I keep the lining panels folded back out of the way as I sew. And I'll go ahead and clip both of these in place. Back to my stitch length of 4. So I'm folding the lining panels back out of the way, and I'm going to sew the exterior zipper panels to the exterior side panel, right sides together, with using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And on this line, we will sew all the way across the zipper. Okay, and we'll repeat that on the other end. Okay, now we want to sew the lining side panels. So right sides together, clip the lining zipper panel only to the lining side panel. You will not clip the zipper in this seam. So when you sew it, the zipper will be folded back as well as the exterior panels. So here you have a gap where the zipper is not sewn to the lining. And we're going to go ahead and sew that also to 5/8 or 1/2 inch seam allowance. And just hold the lining panels back out of the way. Just it's a little bit trickier. And I just sew all the way across the opening. It's not a big deal. Okay, and we'll repeat that and sew the other lining side panel to the other end. Okay, now the next step is a little bit, I don't want to say tricky, it's not tricky, but what we're going to do, if you look at the end, the seam allowances are not attached to each other. So right here, along on the lining only, right next to where the seam allowance is folded back next to the zipper, we're going to cut the seam allowance up to the stitch line, only on the lining. So I literally only cut that part. So just what is over the zipper. And I'm going to top stitch this. We're going to fold these sides up out of the way, and I think I can actually clip that in place so that it will stay. And we're going to top stitch, and this way when we top stitch, it will sew across this portion of the lining and close that hole up that would be at the end of the zipper otherwise. So just be careful to make sure that those parts that you folded back stay folded. I switched back to my stitch length of 5, and I'm just going to top stitch through the exterior through the seam allowance and through that little bit of lining seam allowance that is at the end of the zipper. And I'm using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And it's a little bit thick here over the zipper with the vinyl and the multiple layers of waterproof canvas and the zipper, so I'm just hand stitching. Alright, so now when I press the lining back down, I no longer have that opening here, where before there would be a hole because I didn't sew it over the zipper. Now there is not a hole. And you don't need to top stitch the lining. It's fine. You can press it. So I'm just going to repeat that on the other side. Alright, so let's go ahead and do the other, top stitch the other side panel. So again, what we're going to do is on the lining fabric only, right next to where the seam allowance is folded back next to the zipper, I'm just going to trim into the seam allowance down to the stitching, not through the stitching, just close to it. And then leave the lining folded back. I'm going to press the exterior down toward the seam allowance and fold back the seam allowance except for along the zipper area where we just cut it. So I'm going to clip this back out of the way because we don't want to accidentally sew through that. Alright, and then I'm just going to top stitch along this panel and just make sure one last time that all of my lining stays out of the seam allowance except for right over the zipper. And I have my stitch length set to 5. Alright, so then my whole lining is not attached there, but right over the zipper it is sewn down now, so you don't have that hole at the end of the zipper. So I'm not top stitching the lining panel, but I am going to press it. You could top stitch if you wanted to, probably through just the lining panel, but I don't think it's necessary. I am going to press that real quick though so that they lay nice and flat. The next step, we're going to right now mark the center of everything. So I'm going to, you can use the pattern pieces to mark the centers. You can fold, typically I just fold it in half, bringing the raw edges together, and then you can kind of find the center that way, mark it. You can also put a tiny snip, making sure that it doesn't go past where the seam allowance is with your snip. So you would just fold it right sides together, and then where it folds in the center, just create a tiny snip like that, and that marks the center as well. So that actually might be what I do right now. Some of my centers are marked from when I cut the vinyl, because I had to mark it. Well, when I cut my vinyl, I draw the pattern pieces onto the wrong side. So, alright, and then along both sides of the zipper panels. Snips are not the easiest to cut into the vinyl. And again, just make sure the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, so just make sure that, see, I have these marked here from when I cut it. Just make sure that you don't snip in more than 1/2 inch. Alright, so that one's not marked. It might be harder to fold in half. So this is my exterior back panel, so I'll just find that pattern piece and use the pattern piece to mark my center. And then along the bottom as well, which actually the bottom is marked. When I cut my waterproof canvas, I folded it, and so you can see where the center was along the line because I creased it. I'm still going to place the little snip though in case that line is not as clear when I'm in the process of sewing everything together. Alright, and then on the bottom panels, which I forgot actually to fuse, you want to fuse Decoville Heavy to your exterior bottom panel. So if you didn't do that, like me, you want to do that before you start assembling it. Alright, and then instead of folding the vinyl, I'm just going to use the marks I just made on my lining piece to mark the centers on the vinyl. And I have them marked already on the long end, or long sides. Alright, let me cut out, I'm going to fuse my Decoville Heavy to this real quick. Okay, and I did go ahead and fuse a piece of woven interfacing over the top of the Decoville Heavy, because sometimes when you turn the bag right side out, the Decoville layer can come unfused. This way, if there is a layer of woven interfacing holding it into place, that will be sewn into the seam and it won't pull away. Okay, so here we want to unzip our zippers. Unzip this zipper and unzip the lining pocket, because we will turn it right side out through the hole in this pocket. So first we want to do exterior front. So this is important to make sure the front is the concave. Yes, and I have them marked front zipper panel. Concave is the front and the convex side of the curve is the back. And the front panel is slightly smaller than the back panel, so that's important to get them matched correctly. And also I realized after the fact that I used the wrong measurement for my pocket placement, so I'm going to pop up something over the video during that part where I measure it with the correct measurement, because my pocket's a little bit too high and I can't really fix that now. Okay, so I'm going to put a couple clips on along the top, and then I'm going to match the bottom corners. So I'm keeping the lining folded back out of the way and only attaching the exterior front zipper panel to the exterior front main. Right sides together. So match the top center and then the bottom corners. And then we'll ease our way around the rest of it. moving. Alright, and then when you're going up around the curve, it can look like the main panel is a little bit wavy along the edge, and that's fine because where you're matching is where the end of the clip is at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. That line should be smooth and you shouldn't sew over any puckers or waves in the fabric, but along the edge it will look wavy, and that's the easing of it because the lines match at the seam allowance line, not at the edge of the fabric. Okay, so once that's all clipped in place, I'm going to start at the bottom. I'm going to switch back to a slightly shorter stitch length, so I'll put it on 4. And I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance and make sure that everything else is pulled back out of the way. Your lining is folded back. So you're only sewing through the exterior main and the exterior side panels and exterior zipper panels. Exterior front zipper panel. 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch a few stitches. And it helps for me to push the bag up so that it's up at the end of the sewing machine, and move the bag around like where the needle is, rather than trying to keep your bag flat and sew, and that helps the edges to sew together nicely. Make sure that if you stop and adjust that you do it with your needle in the down position. And you can also, instead of completely removing the clips as you sew around the curve, you can just scoot them out to the edge so that you can sew next to it, and that your fabric or vinyl is still clipped together. And make sure if you make a different size of the bag, the medium and large, the measurements that you use are listed in parentheses throughout the pattern, and it will say either medium or large, and then the measurement for that. So the measurements on the diagrams are for the small size bag. I'm going to, first I like to check my seam allowance to make sure it looks smooth, and then trim. I'm going to trim that down to about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little more than 1/8, but less than 1/4. And I find it easier to trim these seam allowances as I go, rather than all at the end when everything is attached. Okay, so now we want to the exterior front main, and now the lining front main to the lining front zipper panel. Okay, which is this side. So we're going to squish all of this down inside. Lining front main is the one that has the zipper in it. Make sure your zippers are unzipped again. And again, I'm just going to match the top center first. And I usually will put a couple of clips, one to either side of the center. Alright, and then I'll match the bottom corners. Alright, and then ease your way up around the curves. Okay, and then while we sew this, I'll just make sure that all of the exterior and the other side of the lining stays out of the seam allowance. And the back, or that the interior zipper pocket also stays out of the way. So I'm going to sew this together using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Sorry, you can't really see much, I don't think, from here. So I'm just going to double check often that there's nothing else in that seam allowance from inside the bag. And then I'm just folding the interior zipper pocket back out of the way. Other side, again, I'm folding the interior zipper pocket back out of the way. Right, now I'm going to check to make sure that nothing else is sewn into that seam real quick. Okay, and it is not. And then I'll trim this seam allowance. Okay, and now I'm kind of flipping this so that the two front panels are wrong sides together now. And you can see how you did. Looks pretty good. And then I'm going to, let's see, I think I do the exterior. I put the order, yep, the exterior back main is next. So we kind of want to push it so it's inside out, fold the lining zipper panel out of the way. Just make sure here that all of your straps and handles and everything stay out of the way. And I'm matching the top center first. And then I'll match the bottom corner. And then we'll ease in between. In this pocket you do sew into the seam allowance. Since it's a sideways pocket, if it's not sewn into the seam allowance, then it will like slide down to the bottom of the bag. So alright, so we're going to sew this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you can backstitch if you want over the ends of your webbing to just kind of help hold that in place better. And when we trim this seam allowance, we will not trim the webbing ends. Alright, and I actually forgot to back stitch over my webbing, which I do want to do. So I'm going to just go back in and sew right over that part. Okay, so now, well, let me check my seam first. I just kind of feel it with my hand where I can't see it, just to make sure there aren't any puckers or I didn't like sew the webbing into it or something weird. So I'm going to trim this down, but I'm leaving the ends of the webbing. I'm not trimming that portion. This is especially important on the bigger sizes, but really all of them, because you don't want your webbing to pull out of the seam. And then, okay, that's the only part of the webbing that's in the seam actually. Okay, and now one last time we'll repeat this with the other lining panel. So right now I'm just pushing everything kind of inside here, and I'm taking the lining back panel and matching it right sides together with the lining back zipper panel and the lining side panels. This part can get a little bit bulky, and especially with me using vinyl right now. But it's a good way to avoid having a drop-in lining or a binding on your lining, which I know so many people like to avoid. You could definitely alter and sew the pattern differently and put binding inside of it if you like binding, which, I mean, I do think a bound lining is really nice, the way it fits nice and snug inside the exterior. There's no droopiness, but I don't always love sewing them, so. And again, this is probably the most difficult on the small size, because it does get pretty bulky at the end. Like, not what you're sewing through isn't bulky, just the whole thing, the way it's sandwiched up. And I think it's probably a little bit more difficult on the small, and especially since I'm using vinyl. Now we're going to sew this one using a 5/8 inch allowance. I apologize that you definitely can't see what I'm doing here, but I kind of also can't really see. And you can feel with your fingers as you sew along to make sure nothing else is caught in the seam allowance before you sew over it. And if I didn't say, did I say? I'm using a 5/8 inch seam allowance for the lining. And this will help the lining to fit more snugly inside of the exterior. Well, and I also find when your bag is completely finished and it's been turned right side out, if you stuff it super full with fabric or like towels or something and just leave it that way kind of overnight, then the lining stays nice and snug to the exterior. Like it really helps it to kind of form in place or something. Okay, so now I'm going to trim that seam allowance down, and I can trim the whole thing here. There's nothing to exclude. Okay, now we're going to sew on the bottom panels. So I think, which one do I want to do first? I have the lining and the instructions first, so let's do that. I'm going to push the lining zipper pocket kind of up out of the way so it does not accidentally get sewn into the seam allowance. And this might be a little tricky because everything's just kind of smushed together. So first, just focus on matching up your centers. And I sew with the bottom panel up toward my presser foot. So I like to put my clips the way I'm going to sew so that the colored part is on the top, because the back side lays flat and it glides across the sewing machine smoother. So I'm just going to place a couple clips on the long sides next to the center mark. Alright, and then I'm going to mark the center, or match up the centers on the short sides. Now we're just going to ease around the corners. And again, remember, it's the seam line that matches up here, not the edge. And the seam line in this case is 5/8 of an inch in. So it might look wrinkly around the edges, but you just don't sew over those wrinkles. And I like to make sure that my seam allowance is pressed the same way. So I'm going to fold it over toward the side panel. The seam allowance from attaching the main panel to the zipper panels. Okay, once that's all sewn into place, now I will sew that together using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I just kind of am going to start wherever it seems the easiest to get to. And I'm folding the rest back out of the way. I like to start on the one of the long straight edges though. Clip out of the way. All right, and this is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I just really take my time and readjust as necessary as I sew around the bottom and make sure that I'm not sewing over any puckers in the fabric. And if you don't have a stiletto, it's a very helpful tool. It just has a pointy end and you can use it where you can't get your fingers in to guide the fabric right near the needle, or where you don't feel comfortable getting your fingers in. But it's like pointy, so it can hold everything in place. Very helpful. I didn't have one for years, and if you watch a lot of my videos, I was using a tiny screwdriver. So this I got from Mary Beth Made It, and it's custom with my logo, and there's a seam ripper at the other end, but the stiletto I think is my favorite part. Why I never bought one, I don't really know. Just make sure you close it up if you sit it down somewhere that it can roll, because I definitely stabbed myself in the foot with it before as it rolled off my sewing machine right onto my toe. And of course, pointy side down. And again, I always stop to adjust with the needle in the down position. And that holds your seam in place. I'm going to trim these seam allowances. Just be careful with everything here and everything attached that you're not cutting through anything else. We have one last bottom panel. We're almost done. All right, so again, first I'm going to match the center on the long side. Geez. Clearly this is not the easiest thing I've ever done, huh? Making it out of vinyl definitely raises the difficulty level, so keep that in mind. I always suggest to make the first one following the pattern, especially if you're new. I mean, I guess if you've been sewing for years and years and you're experienced in vinyl, go ahead, make it out of vinyl. Make it out of leather, that would be cool. This would look really awesome made out of like one solid color leather, I think. Alright, I'm just matching the center marks on the short ends now. Some people have difficulty with oval bottoms in bags, so a lot of people I know will use staples to staple it within the seam allowance. Look at the edge, more part that will be cut off, because you don't want staples left in your bag. But if you staple it, then it doesn't shift, because I mean the clips will pop off sometimes and things can move. So if you have difficulty with oval bottoms, you might try stapling. I've never done that. Not for a reason, just haven't ever tried it. It might be helpful if you buy a stapler that doesn't have much of an end, or like an overhang, so that you can be precise. Okay, we're going to sew this seam allowance using, it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm still on my stitch length of 4. So here you're not stitching through the Decoville heavy, but right next to it. And the same thing, I always keep my needle in the down position whenever I'm adjusting anything. Hopefully I don't run out of bobbin thread now. It seems like I've been going on the same bobbin for a while. This would be a bad place. And just make sure that the lining and everything is folded back out of the seam allowance. Oh wow, my bobbin thread literally just ran out. I made it all the way around and then it ran out. That's insane. Okay, so I'm just looking around my seam allowance to make sure it looks semi-decent. And I'm going to trim it. You could turn it right side out if you want first so that you can really check it and make sure it's good, but I only want to turn this right side out once. Make sure as you trim the seam allowance that you don't trim anything else, any of the other panels. Okay, now this is probably going to be the most difficult part, which is turning this right side out through the interior zipper pocket, which is kind of smushed in between everything right now. So I'm not going to be able to do this like out in front of me on film kind of. So yeah, I'll be back. Okay, so the whole bag is turned right side out, and I went ahead and pulled the lining pocket out of the inside and folded the raw edges under by about 1/4 of an inch, and now I'm just going to edge stitch that close. I'm using about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and because my bobbin thread ran out, I just put blue in my bobbin thread, so hopefully nobody actually ever like pulls out the bottom of the pocket to look at it, because I don't know who's going to end up having this bag. Okay, so now go ahead and tuck the zipper pocket down inside. And then with this being all vinyl, I can't really press it, so I will probably use like a hot blow dryer and kind of help shape the bag and help the vinyl to hold its shape. So if you get it nice and hot and then kind of like fold out the seams and it cools like that, then it will stay. So I just kind of roll the seams, and I'll use a hot blow dryer to help it hold its shape. But other than that, and I'll stuff the inside, like I said, with large scraps of fabric or a towel. Just get it like really super full, and then the lining will stay in place afterwards. Okay, but our backpack is finished. You've got that angled look of the zipper without having to sew the zipper on a curve. It's actually straight. A nice oval bottom. The zipper pocket on the back. And a flap pocket on the front. And then a slip pocket, which this one can hold like a smaller Kindle style tablet or a like Kindle Paperwhite or whatever else you want to put in there. And then a zipper pocket on the inside front. So lots of storage options in a tiny little bag. And then there's also the medium and large size. So yeah, turned out pretty good. So let me know what you think. Again, as always, let me know what other bags you'd like to see me make out of vinyl or cork or whatever, because I am trying to have options as far as that goes. My bag patterns don't generally call for vinyl, but I do like to show what changes need to be made for people to sew them out of vinyl or cork. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Bye.